All right, it looks like it's just about 12. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the last webinar of the year. My name is Mindy Hunthrop, and I work with the Master of Science in Operations Management program. Just want to remind you that this webinar series is presented by these three programs that you see on the screen. These are the Master of Science in Engineering, the Master of Science in Engineering Management, and the Master of Science in Operations Management. So, tell you a little bit about today's presenter. Mr. Terry Bresnick has more than 40 years of experience in applying the techniques of decision analysis to complex problems of government and industry. He's a field expert in the areas of decision analysis, risk analysis, strategic planning, resource allocation, and budgetary analysis, evaluating of competing alternatives, cost-benefit analysis, and business area analysis. So he's a field expert in a lot of areas. He also served as an officer in the U.S. Army and currently works as a consultant in the private sector. He is an executive senior analyst at Innovative Decisions Incorporated, a company that he co-founded and previously led as president and CEO. He's also currently president of Innovative Decision Analysis. His teaching experience includes time as an assistant professor of systems and decision analysis at the U.S. Military Academy, as well as teaching courses for the MSOM program. He is a registered professional engineer, a certified analytics professional, a certified financial planner, and a fellow in the Society of Decision Professionals. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Terry Bresnick as your webinar presenter today.
Thank you, Mindy. I assume you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Afternoon. It's good to be back with another webinar to share some of my experiences with you. I currently teach the online version of OMGT INEG 5443, which is the course in decision models. So why talk about group facilitation with basically faculty members at the University of Arkansas? After all, we're educators, not group facilitators. But in reality, educators have many skills and talents, but often they have little formal training in topics such as the ones you see on the slide: decision making, strategic planning, creative thinking and cognitive biases, time management, group facilitation. Having taught at both the undergraduate and the graduate level, I firmly believe that these skills can help me teach better by being more in touch with some of the issues that may face my students. I also know that many of you, as I do, have a role as a consultant in addition to teaching. Now, I addressed some of these topics in my webinar last year, so today I thought I'd focus on group facilitation. Now, as a management consultant over the course of more than 40 years, I've facilitated more than 1,500 workshops, seminars, and decision conferences. But when I think back on the times I was a college professor, I often found myself in a position where I had to work to meet the needs of very diverse groups of people, other professors, students, and even clients when I was teaching a role that included some consulting. Typically, there was time pressure, the stakes were high, and the objectives of the participants conflicted. As a professor, I had no real decision-making authority, but I could help the group make decisions based on what I'll call informed consensus based on an open exchange of information. That's what I call facilitation. Now, clearly, educators have authority to make decisions in their own domain, but often they may find themselves in the role of a facilitator to help groups reach agreement on a wide variety of topics. So that's what we're going to focus on today, understanding the basics of group facilitation. I've isolated it to talk about what is a facilitator, what are the roles and responsibilities of the facilitator, become aware of your tasks and behaviors of the facilitator, and the most interesting part in my mind is to talk about different group behaviors that you might encounter and facilitator responses to those types of behaviors. Now, if you look up the definition of facilitator on Wikipedia or in the dictionary, you see a lot of different definitions. This slide depicts one type of definition of a facilitator. And believe it or not, there have been some sessions where I almost felt like that's what I was walking into. So, the definition of a facilitator comes from Kaiser, a book called Mining Root Gold. Really, really good book if you want to do facilitation. Covers a lot of ground. And he basically says a facilitator is a person who helps a group free itself from internal obstacles or difficulties so it may more efficiently and effectively pursue achievement of desired outcomes. The words in yellow really are the key here. And we always start with the objectives and outcomes. You always have to be oriented towards the results that you want. What are the goals? What are the objectives? You're trying to help the group be more efficient and more effective. And you are not the decision maker. You are a helper. And it's really important to keep that in mind, that your role is one of a helper, not of the decision maker itself. Now, let's expand a little bit on the distinction between a facilitator versus a subject matter expert. The facilitator basically owns and manages the group processes that are used in the working sessions. The subject matter expert, on the other hand, or the SME, has expertise on the topic in hand. I'm sure many of you have worked with subject matter experts before. Now, in one of my consulting projects, I was an in-house decision analyst for a government intelligence agency, and I did that for about 19 years. What was interesting is that you can imagine that in that many years, I picked up a lot of substantive knowledge, and quite frankly, I often found myself facilitating participants where I had far more knowledge than they had on a topic matter. And that can be very tricky. A facilitator is supposed to be objective, with no stake in how the decision evolves. But I can't tell you how many times I heard bad or downright incorrect information be espoused by the so-called experts. Personally, I'm a pretty aggressive facilitator, and I tend to push the boundaries of my job as far as I can, and very often I felt it was necessary to cross that boundary and offer some substantive information when the call was necessary to accomplish the mission. Now, as educators, you frequently are the subject matter expert on the topics that you teach. You will have to do double duty as a facilitator. And again, that can be very, very tricky. It's very hard to wear both hats simultaneously and do both jobs well, since they conflict with each other. Now, there's also a distinction I want to make, a difference between how you might facilitate a group versus facilitating a team. A group, as per the slide, typically comes together once or infrequently. They really develop no sense of group identity, and there may be very little reason to expect them to come to consensus. A team, on the other hand, that meets regularly, it has a common purpose, and consensus is often the goal. Not only just consensus, but commitment to the result of the session. So, for example, you may have a departmental working group at your location that meets monthly to discuss departmental activities and presents ideas and feedback to the head of the department. That would be a team as opposed to a group. Now, facilitators can take on a lot of tasks and different roles. Some of them you have to do simultaneously, and some of them actually are in conflict with each other, and that presents a problem sometimes. I often describe my goal as a facilitator as helping the group achieve consensus through open and exchange information. It's my job to define and manage the group process, keep them focused, and get to a sense of commitment. I know some facilitators that as part of the session, just let the group define the process. I'm not a believer in that. Most people don't understand group dynamics and processes and cognitive biases and dysfunctional behaviors and so forth, and they really aren't in a position to define a workable process. I like to say that I can only guarantee or warranty the process if I'm free to implement tried and true group processes. I like to start by defining the key needs, the issues, and concerns up front, and managing expectations right from the start. Some facilitators like to have a very rigid agenda. I don't. I don't like to follow a rigid agenda or a rigid schedule, but rather, I fully understand what the exit criteria are for successful completion. I manage the time in the group in a way that maximizes the probability that the group will get to that point. It's easy for emotions to get in the way, particularly on controversial topics. And it's my job as a facilitator to set a positive tone, to encourage participation, and discourage dominating personalities from taking over. I analyze on the fly. I ask probing questions. I even make suggestions when it's appropriate. If conflicts arise, it's my job to bring in processes to help deconflict. But I am not the deconflictor since I don't own the session itself. I am not the decision maker, and that's an important thing for the facilitator to keep in mind. You don't own the session, you're not the decision maker, and you have to rely on the people who brought you in to take that role. Now, I see it as a facilitator's job to ensure that good notes are taken in the meeting, either by an objective facilitation assistant or by a participant. I used to work what we call decision conferences, which were established by a company called Decision Designs Incorporated, and we always operated in a team of 3 people. The facilitator, who was up in front of the group using quantitative models, facilitating the group, a note taker, whose sole purpose was to listen to the session, synthesize, and this is not a secretary, this is a decision analyst who could understand what was going on. And the third person, often we built computer models, that was the computer operator who would run the decision models. But this notion of keeping notes is very, very important, and sometimes the notes themselves wind up being more important than the outcome of the quantitative modeling. Notes can provide an audit trail of the session as well as the rationale for any judgment. Finally, I see it as my job as a facilitator to summarize and synthesize what happened in the session. Now, as a good facilitator, you need to be multi-talented with a variety of what we will call soft skills. One of those is to have good communication skills. You need to be able to ask questions carefully. There's nothing worse than spending a lot of time debating and disagreeing on an idea, only to later learn that people were not disagreeing over the answer, but rather disagreeing on interpretation of the question. To keep this from happening, you want to make sure you use a clear vocabulary, words that the user is comfortable with, not the facilitator necessarily, but you want to talk in the language of the audience. You want to clarify and elaborate as often as you can. You want to seek feedback from the group on a regular basis to make sure everybody's on the same wavelength. And you want to be consistent in how you're doing things. A second thing you need to be able to do is to listen, not just facilitate, but listen to responses carefully. And it's one of the hardest things for a facilitator to do, to listen to all aspects of the conversation, remembering who said what, interpreting areas of agreement and disagreement, playing it back to the participants. It's very easy to slip away and try and get your mind thinking about what you're going to do next, but you need to be focused on what the people in the room are saying. I find that drinking lots of coffee in a session helps. How you react and how you respond can unintentionally bias the group. So some of the things you need to be able to do in the way of listening is give the speaker your full attention, and you need to stop speaking. Don't worry about what you will do and say next. If you're experienced enough, it'll come naturally. Use listening techniques such as paraphrasing, repeating things word for word, and other techniques like that, and be very cognizant of your body language and expressions and the group's body language and expressions. They can tell from your body language whether you're listening to them, whether you're focused, whether you're into what they're saying, and you can tell how they're responding to you as well. And finally, provide feedback. Make sure that you're interpreting what is said correctly, repeat what you thought you heard, and ask questions to determine if you've got it right. Now, there are quite a few responsibilities that a facilitator has to take on during a session. I believe that your primary responsibility is keeping the meeting going and stimulating the conversation. That said, I know some very, very experienced facilitators that will just stand there silently if the group doesn't carry on a meaningful conversation. You will not intervene. I can never do that. That's what I call a very passive facilitator. We'll talk more about that later. I'm more what I would call an active facilitator. The facilitator should stay neutral on content, and as such, must understand rather than evaluate the individual feelings about an issue. If the group gets off topic, it's the facilitator's job to bring them back and to stay focused. When I say focused, I mean on the situation, not on the individual behaviors. That's a very, very important distinction to make. To the extent that the facilitator can, try and get full participation by all members of the group. That may not be possible. And what we're going to do, we're going to discuss every one of these bullets in a little more detail. So let's start with stimulating the conversation. How do you do that? Well, start by listening actively rather than trying to fully control the meeting. Ask a lot of questions that are non-threatening, specific, and open-ended. Questions that only require a yes-no answer do little for stimulating conversation. We can talk about 4 specific types of questions and that are very popular, and I'll illustrate each of them with a very simple example. Let's say I was facilitating this group to determine the topics which you'd like to hear about next year in the webinar series. I can ask a direct question. A direct question is aimed at a specific person to obtain input on the matter at hand. So I might turn to Mindy and say, I'm thinking about a presentation for next year on improving communication skills. What aspects of that would be of interest to you? Directly aimed at a specific purpose requiring a response. I can ask a general address question. This is open-ended. It's pitched to the entire group so that anyone can respond and stimulate the discussion. So I might turn to you as a group and say, can anyone suggest a topic about which they would really like to hear next year? A third type of question is what we would call a return question. That's one that demands a return from the one who asks it. So as part of the discussion, if Mindy asked me if I thought improving communication skills would be a good topic, I'd return the question to her by saying, interesting idea. What do you think, Mindy? Are there specific topics you'd like to hear about on that? A fourth type of question is called a relay question. A relay question could be deflected to another person, perhaps someone with specific expertise in the area. So if one of you asks me, do you think strategic planning would be a good topic? I might turn to Kurt Michelson, who's one of the other instructors of my course, who is in the audience today, and say, Kurt, you've organized these training sessions before. Would that topic be of interest to you as something that has been covered before? So 4 types of questions. I typically make use of all of them. The second bullet was understand and don't evaluate participants' feelings. Now, as most educators and facilitators know, there are big differences among facts, feelings, and emotions. We can verify most facts, and it's easier to come to consensus about facts. Feelings are very personal, and different people in the group may have different feelings about the very same idea. Different people express their feelings using different emotions. One person may get angry and yell if they're upset by the discussion. Another may start to cry. As a neutral facilitator, it would seem easy to say, let's keep feelings and emotions out of the decision, but that's not realistic or even useful. I recall one session I was running at the National Reconnaissance Office years ago, where we were proposing an approach for analyzing the budget. And then most of you who do budgetary analysis know, often you discount time value of money over money. But we were talking about discounting time value over benefits of programs that would be established in the future. Well, the head of the branch that did future development got very upset by this and literally got up on the conference table, started stomping their feet, and refused to go along with this idea. A real challenge for a facilitator. Yet that was my job. I had to deal with that. I had to deal with it on the spot and get the group back to doing what they needed to do. So your job as a facilitator is to stay objective, accept the feelings and acknowledge them as real, and manage them efficiently. When you're probed with questions, don't evaluate or judge the responses. How can you tell when emotions are being pent up? Look for both verbal and nonverbal clues. Make eye contact. Look for angry expressions. Look for crossed arms that might indicate that a person is shutting down and not listening. Look for slight nods that might indicate assent or dissent. Or look for somebody stomping on the conference table. Sometimes it's necessary to refocus the group. It's not unusual for a group to digress from the topic at hand, and some of that is fine. But if it starts to get in the way of accomplishing the group's mission, you have to bring them back on topic and get them refocused. Always keep the objectives and the exit criteria for the session in mind. And as that great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll wind up somewhere else and not know how you got there. Great advice. Now, I came across this in a book called The Facilitator's Guide. by a fellow named Tom Siebold, and he talks about facilitators we dread. And I find this pretty amusing, and I must admit I've come across most of these types of facilitators. There's the drill sergeant, rigidly stuck on the agenda, puts the clock above all content, just absolutely can't deviate from what was originally planned. There's the guardian. That type of facilitator makes certain that all conversation goes through him or her and not from participant to participant. Very rigid, also known as the Napoleon facilitator. There's the know-it-all, always has the answer. The know-it-all can't say, I don't know. Yet that's very often what a facilitator has to do. The ice cube, very distant, very aloof facilitator, unwilling to personalize the experience, very, very formal, and keeps the distance from the group. The blabber, that's the facilitator who loves the sound of his or her own voice and is constantly having to comment on everything that gets done. The pretender doesn't ask real questions, but only pretense questions that are designed to get the facilitator an excuse to pontificate on topics of their choice. The I can't hear you guy. This is the facilitator who just refuses to listen. No matter what people say, the facilitator will continue on doing what they were doing, following the path they were following. The marathon man. This is a facilitator who piles activities on top of activities, fills up the agenda, doesn't leave room for bathroom breaks, and ignores the need of the groups to reflect on a topic or an idea. The parrot. This is the facilitator who can't help but relentlessly recap every piece of information that was said, restates everything, summarizes everything. Again, a person who likes to hear themselves speak. The Molasses Man. This is the facilitator who is painfully slow, has no feel for pace, variety, or style. The passenger, they're along for the ride. They let people talk too long. They give up the reins of the facilitation, and they're just there basically for the ride. Then there's the storyteller. The storyteller likes to tell too many cutesy stories, never really gets the content, and I'll talk a little bit more about telling war stories. They're okay to tell a war story here and there, but sometimes you could overdo it. Then there's the centerpiece. That's the facilitator that makes himself or herself the real content of the workshop. It is all about the facilitator. Finally, there's the tunnel driver. That's the person who keeps going and doing the same thing hour after hour after hour without deviation, just going down that tunnel until they can see the light at the end. Now, I don't know how many of these types you've encountered, but if you do, I wish you good luck with some of them, and it sometimes creates a situation that's very hard to deal with as a participant. Interesting topic to talk about is in facilitating sessions. As I said earlier, I've facilitated more than 1,500 sessions. I probably have seen every type of group dysfunctional behavior that you'll ever expect to see. But then again, somehow I am never surprised when I encounter something new. Now on this slide, I've identified the ones that I find most common, and we'll talk about each one individually. Now, there's some things you can do as a facilitator that apply to all of the functional dysfunctional behaviors. They across all of them. You need to be friendly, but you need to be firm in confronting the behavior. You just can't let it go on because it'll detract from the group. Next one's very important. Focus on the behavior itself, not on the individual. Don't attack individuals. Don't attack their traits, their characteristics, but focus on the specific behavior at hand. Sometimes it's important to just highlight the impact that their disruptive behavior is having on the group. Perhaps it's delaying things, perhaps it's getting other people angry, perhaps it's just not contributing anything to the session itself. And you might want to suggest some more functional behaviors. That's always a tricky one. People get very, very defensive, and you don't want them to turn off, particularly if they are making some good contributions. What you absolutely want to avoid is a sustained one-on-one argument or exchange with the person who's exhibiting the dysfunctional behavior. You just can't let that happen. And sometimes what you need to do is let others in the group help you deal with the person who's causing the dysfunctional behavior. Maybe it's just one of the regular participants. Maybe it's the owner of the group. Maybe it's somebody who's very well thought of and senior. But sometimes it helps a lot to get other people in the group helping you along with this particular area. Okay, let's talk about dealing with silence. So what we're talking about here, participants in general, most of the participants have nothing or little to say. During the discussion periods, everybody seems to be pretty silent. The group seems to stagnate. People may be introverted or intimidated, and that could be the cause of that. Particularly, I find sessions, when I do military sessions, for example, and there's some general officers in the room and some lower-ranking officers in the room, sometimes they get a little bit intimidated. If that's the case, you probably have the wrong people in the room. Because as I said earlier, the key is open exchange of information if you want to get to consensus. So if you've got people who are just totally introverted or intimidated, maybe you've got some of the wrong folks. So how would you deal with that? If you were the facilitator, now if we were doing this in a live session, I would facilitate a discussion on how we handle these responses. But since we're doing this just online without any groupware that everybody can participate with, I'll just give you a few seconds to think about it. How would you handle a situation where basically you're the facilitator and almost nobody in the group is speaking? Okay, let's see if you came up with any of these ideas. Start by asking probing questions. Force a response using open-ended questions, but again, the 4 types of questions we talked about earlier, make sure you're asking questions that force a response. Sometimes I just absolutely wind up calling upon individuals by name. They may not want to participate willingly. I'll force them to participate. Another way of dealing with this is actually go around the room. Make everybody comment on whatever is going on and force them into the discussion. During a break, if you have some people who you think really have some good knowledge, you know why they were invited to the session because of their expertise, take them aside. Ask if there's a reason for the silence that you can deal with. See if you can get them to participate willingly and to help this notion of dealing with the group silence. Now, I'm sure none of you have ever been in a session where there was a chronic objector who complained about everything. And I hate to admit it, but I've facilitated many sessions that have included participants that just didn't want to be there. They complained about every aspect of the session, to include the lunches. No matter what anyone else contributed, they expressed negativity. This makes for a pretty tough facilitation, since sometimes their attitude is contagious, and at other times it shuts everyone else down. So then, how might you deal with this type of behavior? Any ideas? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. First thing you have to do is keep tempers in check. Sometimes these chronic objectors get very adamant, they get very nasty, they get loud. Sometimes people respond to them in a nasty way. Sometimes it helps to make light of the circumstance, joke about the lunches or whatever they're complaining about. Try to identify the positive part of the experience, and if you can't, reframe whatever issue the person is complaining about in a way that you can eliminate the complaint. Ask for positive recommendations. Go right back to that chronic objector. Recognize the fact that there are certain things they don't like about what's going on, but say, well, what's good about what we're doing? Is there anything positive that you can find? Anything you'd like to see us doing differently? And then worst case scenario, take the person outside, talk to them privately, or get somebody else in the group to deal with that for you. Again, keep the mission in mind, keep the clock in mind, and you just can't let a chronic objector get in the way of your exit criteria. Have you ever been involved in a session where one or more of the participants seems to disengage from the group and engage in side conversations of their own? How might you, as the facilitator, deal with that type of situation? They're just talking, they talk to each other while others have the floor. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. One thing I like to do is remind the group, not the individual. I won't pick on the individual necessarily, that we need one conversation at a time. I usually say, I can't hear. Can we hold it down to one conversation? But sometimes if it's the same person doing it over and over again, I'll ask the offender to share the conversation with the group. They really like to do that. They really want to share what they're saying. and sometimes it succeeds in stopping the side conversations. Again, talk privately to the individual, take them outside, and there are tools you can use. One's called a talking stick or the talking feather. I happen to have one here with me. It was given to me years ago. This is basically an Indian feather on a stick, and the rule is the only person who can talk is the person who's holding the talking stick. I'll read to you what it says. It's an Indian talking feathers. The legend has been told that many Native Americans used the talking feathers in their family gatherings around the campfire ring. It's told that only the person holding the feathers could talk, and then they were passed to the next person wishing to talk. The talking feathers were never used to condemn, but to express one's feelings, desires, and compliments others, thus creating close family ties. So I've used this before. It works pretty well. It doesn't have to be anything formal like a talking stick. It could be a pencil. It could be a piece of chalk. It could be an eraser. But whoever holds it is the only one who's allowed to lead the conversation. Now, the next behavior is pretty similar to the chronic objector, but a little bit different. But at least these participants are in their own minds trying to work the mission. They are the dominators. They dominate the conversation. They interrupt others. They have to make their voices heard. They present their opinion as having more expertise than anyone else's. So, how might you handle this type of behavior? Now, you have to recognize that sometimes that dominator does have value, and if it's temporary, let it go for a little bit. Acknowledge the dominator's contribution, involve others in the discussions, force the discussion away from the dominator, identify the positive in the experiences, good things in what the dominator is doing, ask for positive recommendations, and again, I've had this one for almost every one of the behaviors, talk privately to the individual, but you got to do it in a way that doesn't get them all upset and turns them off or gets them to leave. Sometimes what I found works are to have ground rules. One ground rule might be before someone gets to speak a second time, at least 3 other people have to speak. Another may be no one gets to speak for more than 2 minutes at a time before they can come back and say something more. They're helpful, doesn't always work, but you've got to do something to keep that dominator from letting you get to your exit criteria. Rambling conversations. Who doesn't have and like to relate war stories related to the topic at hand? This is somewhat akin to the dominator. It tends to get the group off focus. Now, some war stories are helpful. I like to tell them. I like to tell related events. But if they tend to dominate the conversation, what would you do? How would you handle the rambling conversation? Think about it for a few seconds. Get the group focused. Get them back on the topic at hand. Deflect the errant conversation. You might comment on it. You may make something to close out the discussion, but get back to the problem at hand. Restate the urgency and the time constraints that you're facing. Sometimes people just lose track of what's going on. You're the one who's responsible for getting them to the mission at the end of the session. So you've got to get them back to the urgency and to the time constraints. Sorry about that. This is another one that's come up a lot lately. Off-the-wall comments. This has been very problematic in a lot of male-dominated sessions, for example. I used to run military sessions an awful lot. It was not unusual for people to make jokes, and but I think that's changing. We're in the middle of a major cultural change regarding suggestive, harassing, and off-color comments. I don't think I've ever seen the like of what's going on today in Hollywood, the government, the private sector, people going back to comments made 14, 15 years ago or when they were 14, 15 years old. But this does happen occasionally in a session, and the question is, how do you handle it if this occurred in one of your sessions? Somebody makes an off-color remark, an inappropriate remark, what do you do? Give you a few seconds here. You absolutely cannot allow this to continue, but you want to avoid direct confrontation in front of the group. I mean, that's That's something that doesn't help. Take the individual aside, be firm, be polite, or have a respected member of the group take that person aside and deal with the issue. But you just can't let it go on. And the tricky part here is sometimes you never can tell what some people are going to consider to be an off-the-wall comment. I remember, I'll tell a war story. I remember doing a session years ago, and we were doing a budgetary analysis. We were creating cost-benefit analyses, efficient frontiers, allocating dollars in the way that get you the most benefit that you can. And I used an expression that I'd used many, many years, and I've heard other people use. We talked about the goal of the analysis as being able to get the most bang for the buck. I'm sure most of you have heard that expression. Turns out I had one woman in the group who complained vigorously that that was sexist. It was a terrible comment to make. It relates back to the old days when women were forced into prostitution. Now, I never would have picked that one up. I never would have figured that one out. So you never can tell what somebody might react to in a very interesting way or a very different way. Dealing with latecomers. While this may be less serious than some of the other behaviors, this is something that I have to deal with all the time. An extreme case of this is when I may be facilitating, say, a 2-day decision conference, and someone shows up for the first time on the second day and expects everyone to wait until that person is brought back up to speed. How do you handle something like that? A participant arrives in the middle of a focus group or a working session. How do you handle getting them engaged, getting them involved without having to go back and redo everything? Give you a few seconds here. What you don't want to do is stop the entire group and repeat everything. It's just not fair to the other participants, and it gets you off track, and it gets you away from your mission. What I would tend to do is take the individual aside, bring them up to speed. Probably not just myself, but I pick someone in the group who I know can handle this, take them aside, or if I'm working with a team of people, as I said earlier, have one of my team take them aside, bring them up to speed. And if necessary, have them stay afterwards to complete the exercise or the voting. If we've already voted on things, I do not reopen the voting for them. If they participate in future voting, that's fine. But I cannot just go back and let everything happen all over again just because they happen to be late. Now, aspect of this is sometimes I'll run decision sessions where I'll have a 2-day decision conference, then a week or two later I'll have a second 2-day decision conference. And the worst thing that can happen is people come to the second one that weren't there for the first one. You have to slow the whole group down, bring them up to speed. So I generally use a ground rule. If you can't come to both sessions, don't come at all. Send somebody who can participate both in the first session and in the second session, because we just don't have the time to redo everything for a latecomer. Now, conflict. I'm sure that you've all been in sessions where there was some sort of conflict. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I tend to get worried if early in the session all heads are shaking yes. Consensus is rarely that easy. I want diverse perspectives. I want opposing points of view. These are inevitable in sessions where the objectives of the participants are at odds. Another war story, I did a job years ago for the city of Chicago where they brought me in to see if there should be a light rail system in the Chicago Loop. And they had been doing this for months and months and months, and every time they'd walk in the room, everyone would start yelling at each other and screaming, and they'd never get anywhere. There were two main constituencies. Those who felt this would be great for business, it was absolutely essential, and it was safe, and another group who felt it was way too expensive, it was potentially dangerous, and it shouldn't be done. And they just could not get past the emotions. So what we did is we broke them up into two separate groups. We used a multi-objective decision analysis model to lay out all the objectives and the goals that each of the groups had separately. They had the same set of objectives, but they could prioritize them differently. They could put different weights on the prioritization of the objectives, and they could score the different alternatives differently. And lo and behold, when we got to the end of the analysis, it turned out there were only two things that they really disagreed on, whether it was safe, and so they decided to hire an objective safety consultant, and they would agree to abide by the results of the safety analysis. And the other item was the affordability of it. The group that thought they were going to have to pay for it said they just couldn't afford it. It would take away from other things. But lo and behold, they then discovered that there was another constituency willing to put some money towards it and the interest of business, and that issue went away. So sometimes managing the conflict is just identifying the opposing points of view, defining areas of agreement, using effective problem-solving techniques such as the MODA analysis, identifying the areas of disagreement, and in some cases, trying to actually resolve the differences by whatever way you can. Now, conflict can be dealt with several different techniques. You can avoid the conflict. In this situation, there's no winner, there's no loser, no solution. You basically give up, you withdraw, and you leave. Not a great solution. You'll probably have to deal with it again later, but it solves the immediate issue of the conflict. Another is collaboration. Here's a phrase you hear all the time, win-win. Generate solutions, you probe, you brainstorm to find what's important to one and what's important to the other, and get in on areas where one has an importance, the other doesn't. Accommodation. This is often what happens, and in this case, somebody wins, somebody loses. Somebody gives in, they yield, they smooth over. I'm watching what's going on this government budget that's due this Friday. I'm wondering to see which of these techniques is going to happen to get us to a budget. Compromise. That's another technique. There's no winner, there's no loser, but you make trades, you look for a middle ground, you look for the lowest common denominator. That tends to resolve the conflict, but often it does not come up with the best solution. If the least common denominator is rarely the best way to solve a problem. Finally, there's domination. Somebody absolutely wins, somebody absolutely loses, big time, and that's because they were overwhelmed. The defense wasn't very good from their point of view. There was heated argument. Somebody might have pulled rank, but it's very similar to accommodation, but this is more a domination situation, more forced. Now, you can look up facilitation in a lot of different places, and in Wikipedia, I was able to find a couple of what they call the 10 Commandments, 10 Commandments for Facilitators. Now, some of these I find very good, some of them I find very, very bad. Now, on this slide, remember I talked before about two different types of facilitators. The active facilitator, who really gets up there and leads the session and forces the way through, and the passive facilitator. First, I'll show you the 10 Commandments for the active facilitator. Basically, you are there to help the group process. You're not there to solve the issues. You're there to get through the group process and get them to their exit criteria. You always have to stay focused on the goal of the session. And you got to recognize that there'll be a lot of good rational arguments, but rational arguments will not always win over intense emotionalism. You have to listen to what the group is telling you, and you have to be flexible in your facilitation approach. You may have laid out a quantitative technique, or you may have laid out a scoring technique. Sometimes it fails. It just won't work. And if it does, you have to shift to another, and you have to do that very quickly. You always have to display a positive attitude, because the group is going to feed off of it. Never, ever display anger to the group, even if it's justified. I have gotten angry in some sessions, really got frustrated at certain people. You can't let it show. You just have to bite your tongue, smile, and keep on going. I find it's important to maintain your sense of humor and use it with the group. You have to stay aware of your schedules, your time, and get to those exit criteria. And for me, the most important thing is, as a facilitator, even though it's very stressful, I try to relax and I try to have fun. If you don't enjoy what you're doing, if you don't enjoy facilitating the sessions, if they're nothing but stressful activities to you, don't do it. There's nothing worse than not enjoying your work. Now, that's my perspective on facilitation. I agree pretty much with this active view, but in the interest of fairness, I thought it was important to present the opposing perspective. So here are the 10 Commandments for a passive facilitator. Don't do anything the team can do for itself. Intervene only to satisfy the team's needs, not your own. Wait before intervening. Give the team time to solve the problem on its own. Start now with validating the individuals in the group. It's all about them. Avoid editing. Let the team use its own methods and language. I think it is important to speak in the language of the participants rather than the facilitator, but sometimes you have to get beyond that. Try to speak no longer than 30 seconds at a time as the facilitator. Keep the group going. Do more asking than telling. Do more listening than talking. Don't try to talk over the team. It always backfires. It always backfires to try and do that. When you hear the same things for the third time, intervene. They could go around in circles. It happens very often, and that's the time you do have to step in and keep things from just going round and round and round. And when the group falls silent, if you're a passive facilitator, that's your cue to keep silent. Again, not my style, but these may work for some of you. Now, that basically concludes the presentation part of the lecture, of the webinar. Now, one thing I often do is I train facilitators, and if we were doing this in a live session, I'd have you go through an exercise. I'll just tell you what the type of exercise might be, because you may want to do something like this on your own, to practice your facilitation skills, to work with others in your office to give each other the skills. So a typical exercise, and I've used this exercise, I've been a participant, I've been the facilitator for it. This has been modified from one that you can find in a lot of books. This one happened to come from a book by Pfeiffer. It's called the survival exercise. So in the first part, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, you're on a retreat, in this case I said by the University of Arkansas. You and 25 others become adrift on a rented yacht in the ocean. An unknown storm came out, causing a fire, destroyed much of the yacht, and now the yacht is sinking. You're not quite sure where you are because some of the navigational equipment's been destroyed, and you've got to figure out what to do. So I present the people in the facilitation session with a list of items, and they've got to decide what they will take with them. They have a rubber life raft, and raft can carry 12 people. Remember the 26 of you here. The raft can carry 12 people, and all the items on the following list. Your task is to select the top 6 items. That's what the list looks like. And I'm not going to go through this at all. You can change the list to meet the needs of your particular audience. But again, that's part 1 of the exercise. Try to come to consensus to a facilitated session of what items to take. Then the interesting part, now that you know what you're going to take, you have to figure out who's going to go in the lifeboat. It'll only hold 12. There are 26 of you. What are the criteria that we'll use to decide who goes in the lifeboat? So it's a fun exercise. It generates some pretty good discussion. You can improve your facilitation skills, and you can help others improve their skills as well. So that basically concludes the presentation. At this point, any questions for me? If you have questions, what you can do is put them in the chat, and Mindy will read them out later. While you're doing that, she'll give you some more information on the program at Arkansas, and we'll come back after she gives her explanation, and we'll see if there are any questions that can be answered.
Yes, thank you, Terry. Just want to remind all of you that we do have a few really great online degree options. As you see now, the Master of Science in Operations Management at a glance is on your screen. So this degree consists of 30 credit hours, which is 10 graduate courses, up to 4 prerequisites. The real great thing is how affordable the degree is. So you can get the entire degree for around $12,000, depending on those prereqs. And again, you can be typing your questions in the chat box right now if you have any. Another program that we offer is the Project Management Graduate Certificate. This is actually only 4 classes, and the great thing about this is all 4 of those classes can count toward your operations management degree, which is a great way to get 2 credentials to add to your resume. And it looks like we do have one question asking about a copy of the slides. So the recording of the webinar will be posted to our website within a few days from this session, and then we can check with Mr. Bresnick to see if he wants to share the slides or not. Looks like we've
I have no problem sharing this. I have no problem sharing the slides whatsoever.
Okay, great. So we can email those to those who participated if you're interested. And if you want the slides, kind of let me know. I can send those to you, Tiffany. So we have another question asking, what is the purpose of the last case scenario? Is it for an icebreaker or a full session, and how long does it usually take to get through?
Oh, the exercise, I use that as a training. It's facilitator training more than anything else. I do use icebreakers at my sessions quite a bit. Some of the most common ones I use, let's say it's an organization that's it's a team. They meet together regularly. I might say something like, it's 5 years in the future, your organization and the topic they addressed at today's decision conference was wildly successful. Your leader has gotten all kinds of awards. What was the one thing that happened today that would lead to the success? And halfway through, I change it and say, you failed miserably today. What was the one thing that led to the failure? That's one exercise I would typically do. Another icebreaker I'll often use as a facilitator is get everybody to go around the room and they have to tell 2 truths and 1 lie about themselves. And as they give those 3 things, the others have to decide what is the lie, what is the truth. Icebreakers are good. I don't let them get in the way. I try and keep them related to the topic that the people are actually there for. But the exercise at the end of the lecture, that's more for training purposes. Okay, I saw the question. The question was, how would you recommend taking notes if there are more discussions going on in the session simultaneously? We often do use breakout rooms. We take the group and divide and conquer on occasion. And if it's only 1 or 2 breakout groups, I can use my team if I have a team. Otherwise, I will have each of the breakout sessions assign their own note taker, give them a little bit of guidance as to what it is I am looking for in the way of the notes. And what we're trying to do here, we're not trying to keep a transcript. I will rarely write down, Tom said this and Jerry said this. The person should be listening and synthesizing and summarizing what went on. Because we're really trying to attribute, in fact, that is one of the general rules of most facilitation sessions, is non-attribution at the end. We want open exchange of information, but we want to have a non-attribution environment. And to me, one of the worst things you could do is anonymity. I've done some sessions using groupware, and where people don't have to say who they are. I think that's horrible for facilitation, but a lot of people will disagree with me on that one. Any other questions for me? If not, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for listening. As you can tell, I am passionate about this. I do it a lot. I have fun doing it, and I appreciate the opportunity to give this webinar. And yes, you may follow up with my email and ask any other questions you want. The email is on the front slide. More than happy to answer any questions you have that you can't do through the chat room. I'll turn it back over to Mindy right now.
Yes, thank you, Terry. What you see now is just a full schedule of our webinar series. The next presentation will be January 23rd, and registration will open for that probably early next week, so just kind of watch for that. And thank you all for attending. If you have questions or if you're not able to find Mr. Bresnick's information, you can email me and I can point you in the right direction of him. So if there are no other questions, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a good holiday season.